Sarah Hodges. I'm the Associate Dean of the Graduate School here at the University of Oregon, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our second, this is our first year of Distinguished Alumni Speaker coming back to Idaho and tell us about what they're doing. So this is the second speaker in the first year of the series. We hope these talks will become an annual event, and we're on our way to making them be that. We just announced our call for distinguished alumni speakers for next year, so if you know of anyone, talk to your department head, talk to the director of graduate studies in your department, come talk to me afterwards. I'd be happy to hear about that, someone you'd like to nominate. And if you particularly have good ideas about distinguished female alumni, we would be very happy to hear them. In our first year, all we got were male nominations, so we're talking for some female alums. As you know, the UO's graduate students are all up to wonderful things, and both while they're here on campus and then when they leave, they do wonderful things as well. In this series, I would like to highlight those achievements, the very things that our graduate students have done in their lives. And this year, for this year's series, we particularly asked departments to nominate graduate students who had gone on to make their mark outside of academia, so people who had careers outside of professorship. And the nomination were so good that we had to actually ask for more money for the program, so we'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences that came through with a little bit of a donation there, as well as two generous and kind anonymous donors who helped us pay for the 4 speakers this year. So we are very committed in the graduate school to helping our graduate students find careers, find jobs that are exciting and interesting and that use the things they learned in graduate school. And in the past especially, that has meant for PhD students jobs in academia, but the academic job market has changed. And at the same time, fortunately, others have recognized that the kinds of skills that graduate students learn, we're actually talking about utility, John was talking about skills in analysis and synthesis and integration. Other fields have recognized that the skills that PhDs have are very valuable for their jobs, and certainly things like globalization and the newfound respect for people who can analyze the gobs of digital data that everybody is now producing. We find the graduate students are very valuable. So there's a little bit of a distribution lag there, though, so that's part of the reason why we encouraged this year to have speakers who are making their mark outside of academia. Some of you may know the first speaker was Bill Hawley, who's a CDC entomologist who works with mosquito-borne illnesses. In spring term, we'll be hearing from chemistry PhD Faye Mao, who's the founder of two very successful biotech companies, and also from biology PhD Dennis Liu, who's a film director and head of educational media and executive director of Tangled Bank Studios, which is the movie-making wing of the Howard Hughes Institute, a medical institute. Of course, today's main event is John Shurts, and I'm going to let Jeff Osler from the history department introduce him and of course, thanks.
So I was very pleased when I was asked to introduce our speaker, John Shurts, someone I've known and have learned a lot from for a long time now. John, to speak formally for a moment, received his undergraduate degree at Colorado College, and then, like many misguided young souls, decided to go to law school. Fortunately for him, and for many of us in this room who also got to know him when I did, after getting a JD from Lewis and Clark, John had the good sense not to practice law and instead decided to enter the PhD program in history at the University of Oregon. And while here, he wrote a really very exceptionally fine dissertation on a very important topic. And it was the first really full-length study of this topic. It was the U.S. Supreme Court's 1908 Winters decision, which is the key decision affecting Indian water rights in many parts of the United States. I was on that committee along with Dan Pope and Jim Moore. The advisor for John's dissertation was the late Richard Maxwell Brown. And John's revised dissertation was published in 2000 by the University of Oklahoma Press. The title was Indian Reserve Water Rights, the Winters Doctrine in its Social and Legal Context, 1880s to 1930s. And as the subtitle makes clear, there's a 5-decade time span there in reference to social and legal context. This wasn't just a study of the court decision itself, but rather it was a rich and multi-layered account of the context for the decision and also the way in which the decision then began to be applied and formulated in various places over the next several decades. And in that sense, I think it was legal history at its very best. Now, When John was finishing his PhD here, all of us who knew him wished that he would make a career as an academic historian. But the whole time that John was in our program, he was very poor, which isn't really so surprising. He was a graduate student, but he seemed to us exceptionally poor because he apparently couldn't afford shoes. One would regularly see John barefoot, and we didn't really want to, impose our differential power relationship on him and ask him why he was barefoot, but we felt very sorry about that. And so he was finishing. He decided that he wanted to become rich. And upon discovering at some point that to become an assistant professor in history was not a way to do that, he decided to return to the practice of law. And in various ways, that's what he's done. Centrally, over the past several years, serving as General Counsel for what's now titled the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which is an agency that was established under federal legislation 1980 under the Northwest Power Act, and has its responsibility and mission to plan for affordable and reliable energy, while at the same time enhancing fish and wildlife throughout the Columbia River Basin. And in addition to that main work, John regularly teaches courses on subjects like environmental history and energy law at the University of Portland, where he's based in Portland and elsewhere. And he also continues to be an active scholar, and I'd like to think that he's using what he learned as a historian there, having contributed recently, for example, an overview of the 1964 Columbia River Treaty between the United States and Canada. He contributed an overview of that to a volume that was recently published by Oregon State University Press. So it's wonderful to see John down from Portland. Welcome,
Jeff.
John, and he will speak to us.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much to everyone, the graduate school and the history department. It's just fun to be back and see people that I've worked with when I was here. I was here from '89 to '97, so it's been a while. And one thing I want to apologize for, I am living proof that you can have a flu shot and still get the flu pretty bad. So I got it about 3 weeks ago, and I'm still getting over it, but I normally don't need a mic, but my voice is going, so I'm going to stay close to the mic. So they asked me to come down and talk about some of the work I've done, and I decided to take the opportunity to actually tell two stories. One is going to be about the Allegheny River and the Seneca Nation, and the other is going to be from the Yukon River and the Yukon River InterTribal Watershed Commission, Watershed Council. And I want to talk about some river basins, and so it's because that's really what I cared about. I grew up as a river rat. I cared about rivers. I cared about kayaking and floating rivers. I cared about the work on them. So I really cared about river basins and water. And eventually that's where I wanted to work in. So I went to law school and I went to history school. I didn't really care where I was going to end up. I just knew I wanted to work on rivers and water, and it worked. I did. So that's where I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So neither story is going to be from the Columbia, and that's where actually, as Jeff said, that's where I've been working for the last 20 years, is in Columbia River energy and fish and wildlife. And I can talk about the Columbia all day, and in fact, I got very polished presentations on the Columbia River Treaty and whatever. But I actually decided not to do that. I decided to talk instead about step back and talk about these two particular river basins and work I did. And I did it for two reasons. One of them is the work that I ended up doing both for the Seneca in the Allegheny and in Yukon actually represents the best marriage of both the law work and the big river sort of development and planning and management that I do. But it also was a chance to actually make quite a bit of use of the history and law study of native water rights, Indian reserve water rights that I did here. So these are two of the best examples in my career in the last decade of sort of putting the whole package together. So it was kind of neat. So the second reason I want to tell the story is both of these, oddly enough, came to nothing. And I put a lot of work into them. And I'm still coming to grips with why they came to nothing and what to make of them and what to do with them. So part of that is this isn't a polished talk. This gave me the opportunity to sit down and think about both of these pieces of work, what they meant, and really what their future might be, at least particularly the Yukon work. So with that, we're gonna get started. And so the first is going to be about a story about the Allegheny River and Seneca Nation. And this one's going to take a little while to tell, and I apologize. It's really got three parts to it. One is I have to go back through a little bit of the history from 18th century all the way up to about the 1950s, just to set the stage for particularly the Seneca Nation in New York. Second part of it then is some things happened in the 1950s and 60s that are very important, and you need to know them. And then the third brings it to modern time and how I got involved. So it's going to take a while to tell this one, and I apologize. By the way, this is the Allegheny River. It's not in the New York where the Seneca Nation is, and I think we'll explain why that is in a bit. It's actually a little bit downstream in Pennsylvania, but it looks like what the area would have looked like we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about, let's see how well this thing works. All right, we're going to talk about the Seneca Nation. Seneca Nation is the westernmost of what's called the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or the Iroquois Confederacy or the Six Nations, many names you hear about it. They were the westernmost. They're called the Keepers of the Western Door. So good picture here that shows sort of basically their historic territory. This one is an even better way of looking at it, a little harder to see. So their historic territory is what is now much of western New York, shading into bits of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. And one particular important place to know about, which was the heartland in the 17th, 18th centuries, the Genesee River Valley. Genesee River Valley bisects New York, flows north up into the lake, and that's where the main villages, towns, fields of the nation were at that time. But they arranged all over western New York, and including down into southwestern New York and what's the Allegheny area. But their heartland was really right in the center here in the Genesee Valley, River Valley area. In the War for American Independence, the Iroquois leadership officially tried to stay neutral between the British and the new forming U.S., but it wasn't that successful. And particularly a lot of the fighters for the nations, and particularly a group of very excellent Seneca fighters, ended up fighting for British units in the war. And for that reason, in 1779, Washington ordered General John Sullivan and a bunch of his units and some other commanders to take their units deep into New York. It was called the Sullivan Expedition. And their mission was, and I give you the quote, it was not merely overrun but destroy the Iroquois-British alliance in that area. And in doing that, they forced one pitched battle, but really what happened was that Sullivan moved his army away from the battlefront and moved through the Seneca lands, through the Genesee River Valley in particular, and burned every town, every house, every field, killed everybody they could find. And the whole point of it was exactly what it sounds like, which was to visit such pain on the people where they live that the warriors would leave the battlefront and come back home. And that's what the Sullivan Expedition did. It particularly moved through the Genesee River Valley, but it also, a guy named Brodhead working with them, hit some of the other areas, including in the southwest part of New York. They destroyed close to 50 towns were destroyed in this thing. So as a tactic to help the war, it didn't really have a whole lot of meaning, but the effect on the Seneca was tremendous. It was just devastating. The name that in Seneca language for Washington is actually town destroyer. It's what the name that they gave him. Oddly enough, they gave him that name before the war, and they gave it to his father, so it shows what life might have been like before the war. But the events during the war really brought this to a conclusion, to a sort of magnified the events. And when it was done, there was virtually nothing remained in the Genesee Valley of the Seneca communities. After the war, the Seneca tried to rebuild in the Genesee, but it wasn't really ever that successful. Recreating kind of the vibrant towns and communities never worked that well, especially because in the aftermath of the war, there becomes a lot of pressure for sale for non-Indian settlers. And what will actually happen is that it isn't that many decades into the 19th century that the Seneca sort of cede and give up on the Genesee, and they coalesce, the heartland coalesces further into New York, further into western New York, and particularly in the southwest in the Allegheny River Valley. So, and there's going to be a reason why this is important, but that's sort of a basic setting that happens during the war. After the war, basically two things happen. One is there's a significant amount of diplomacy that happens between the Six Nations and including the Seneca. And there's also a tremendous pressure to basically sell and to sell out lands and to allow non-Indian settlers. So you get both of these pressures happening at the same time. Most important for the story is what was called the fundamental treaty between the Seneca Nation and the other Six Nations with the U.S. It's 1794 treaty with Six Nations, also called the Pickering Treaty, was signed at Canandaigua, if I pronounce the name correctly. And it's one of the very first treaties that the U.S., after the Constitution, signs with anybody. It was signed by George Washington, Town Destroyer. I've seen a copy of the original is in display case in Seneca Nation in New York. And to the Seneca, the treaty is still what it says it is. It is a treaty of peace and friendship, perpetual peace and friendship between sovereign nations, a treaty that affirms national borders and land rights. And it's still the foundational treaty for how the Seneca understand their relationship to the United States. Now, it's a treaty with the Six Nations, so there's provisions for all of them, but the key provision for the Seneca is in Section 3. And it is a section that begins, the land of the Seneca Nation is, and then it describes a big chunk of western New York. And it basically describes much of the Genesee River Valley at that time still is theirs, and then it's down into the Allegheny and other areas in southwest New York, and then it's up north to the Erie, Lake Erie and the Niagara country. So it describes a big chunk of western New York, and then it has these words, and remember these words because they become important later. It says, the United States acknowledged all the land to be the property of the Seneca Nation, and the United States will never claim the same, nor disturb the Seneca Nation in their free use and enjoyment thereof. It shall remain theirs until they choose to sell the same to the people of the United States who have the right to purchase. So that was the provision that was hard fought and plunked into the treaty. Sell parcels the Seneca then did over the next 50 years. There's an immense amount of pressure in the Seneca to try to reduce that land base from both the U.S. government officially and from settlers and others moving into New York. And so there's a series of these subordinate land deals that tear off of the 1794 treaty. And not all of them are legitimate, not all of them are arm's length, because there were many people who really wanted to get all the land and get it any way they could. And there really were movements at the time that would actually move the Seneca and other of the Six Nations out of New York and move them to Indian Territory. Same thing obviously happening with the nations in the Southeast. There was ideas and proposals and desires to have the same thing happen in New York, but it didn't, and that's important as well for the story. The Seneca put up an enormous amount of resistance to the idea of actually being forcibly moved out of New York. And so by about 1850 or so, it kind of coalesces down to what we know of as the Seneca Nation today. Because there's a lot of consolidation, a lot of sales, but at the same time, a reaffirmation of some reserve lands and national borders. And this is what you end up. The Seneca occupy, they're in purple, occupy two chunks of western New York that are still Seneca Nation. One of them is the Cattaraugus country, Cattaraugus Creek, it's right up against Lake Erie. But the part most important for this story is going to be the Allegheny Territory and the Allegheny River in southwestern New York. And the Allegheny portion is what really matters here. And I'm going to move to this one. The Allegheny portion, this is a map from about 1890. Allegheny portion of the Seneca Nation occupies 30,000 acres. It includes most of the Allegheny River Valley when it's in New York. It comes from Pennsylvania, goes to New York, arcs back into Pennsylvania. So most of it, when it's within the Allegheny Reservation, the Seneca, is most of the Allegheny River that's within the borders of New York. And I have to say it that way because when you go to Seneca Nation, you're not in New York. They have a big sign there that says, you're no longer in New York, you're in Seneca land. It just happens it's within the overall borders of the state of New York by our political geography. And as you can see from the maps I showed before in this one, the Allegheny Reservation of the Seneca Nation hugs that river. That river curves like this. It's a wooded river bottom with pretty steep wooded sides, and it just the spine of the nation is the river, and the river is the spine of the the people are very identified with the Allegheny River. And the river bottom in the downstream portion, this is all of it, but it's this downstream portion which was the best river bottom. It was the most fertile lands. It was a place where the Seneca established by the 1850s most of their handful of towns, their longhouses and their fields. So there's the town of Cold Spring, Red House, Annaville, Shango, a whole bunch of others. And that's where they basically ended up coalescing and focusing their life. And from 1850s for the next 100 years, life in this area in the Seneca Nation involved farming, a significant amount of hunting in the woods on either side of it. Basically timber harvest and trees from woodlots in the hills and the side. Gathering significant amount of plants and animals and mollusks from the riverbed, and fishing in the river. And then for those of you who know, most of the Iroquois nations, including the Seneca, a lot of the men eventually started moving into New York City for seasonal work in construction. You think of the Mohawk workers on the high rises, but really a lot of them did in various ways. So that's the economy and life and culture in Seneca Nation for all this period of time. All right, it's got that. So sorry, that was got to run through this, but it kind of gives you a setting. And this map, all these names on here are all the different Seneca farms, families, where they lived and where they cultivated. All right, and this is not from Seneca. This is again downstream in the Allegheny, but it's what kind of would have looked like. Crank it back in your mind 100 years, but the towns of about that size, fields everywhere that you'd see in that area. All right, so now we got to go to part 2, which is what happens in the Allegheny, and we have to shift to the Allegheny River. So here's a picture of the Allegheny River. It rises in western Pennsylvania. It flows north into Seneca, New York, and then into Seneca. Eventually a small arc there, and then it arcs back into Pennsylvania, flows across Pennsylvania. And then down in Pittsburgh, that's where the Monongahela and the Allegheny come together and form the Ohio River, the Three Rivers area in Pittsburgh. So we have to shift and unfortunately, we have to talk about Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh becomes, unfortunately, somewhat of the bad guys in the story, and there'll be more to it as that. So the Allegheny, the city of Pittsburgh, as people know, it evolved in the 1890s and into the 1900s as a major industrial town. It becomes a home of steelworks and many other metalworks. It's a place of glass factories. It's a place of chemical plants. And there's a substantial number of coal and other mines actually upriver too, right outside of town. So the city's developing. Downtown, the so-called Golden Triangle, which is where the two rivers come together and make the third river. So that's the core of the downtown, was where the office buildings of industry and finance, all the wealth that started to get concentrated. And they've got a problem. And the problem is economic development of the downtown core in this period of time was stymied by the fact that this is a floodplain, and it would regularly flood. And so city, floods and floodplains mean a lot of things, and I spent a lot of time in my work on floodplains for basically trying to resurrect them. But in this period of time and place, it was just a problem. It was an economic development problem. Pittsburgh could not flourish in its ultimate dreams if you couldn't solve this flood problem. And at the same time, this is a period of time when people started thinking that the solution was that you need to build big flood risk management, flood control structures upriver. If you build a dam and a reservoir, then you can, knock down that peak, and therefore you don't have a flood problem where you're trying to protect. And if you can't figure out what this is going by now, then you're not as sharp as I think you are, but probably are. So beginning in the 1930s, this very, it's the Golden Triangle here, but it's a very powerful triangle of business leaders, city and state officials, and congressmen from especially western Pennsylvania go looking for help. And they mostly approach the federal government, and they ask the federal government for funds to find some flood control, build some flood control infrastructure in the rivers there in some way. And what Congress does is it eventually authorizes the Corps of Engineers, the Army Corps, to assess all the river basins above Pittsburgh, so they go both in the Allegheny and the Monongahela, and look for possible sites for a dam and possible sites for storage reservoirs, and provide estimates of the costs and benefits. And so they do. They begin a significant set of studies. And while they're doing it, they actually also identify a second benefit. So one benefit is flood control, But Pittsburgh also has a separate problem, which is some of the industry and some of the mines, especially upriver, are starting to leak contamination into the river. And it's minor, and at most flows, it's not a big deal. But they're starting to develop in late summers, in low flow years, a contamination problem right through the city. And so it becomes obvious to the Corps that they can solve both problems with one thing. If you build a dam and a storage reservoir, you can store water, knock down the flood peaks, store the water, and then in summer you can release water and basically augment the flows and just dilute the contamination problem away. So the Corps presents to the Congress a study plan to build dams and reservoirs that will bring both those benefits. So the Corps identifies a number of possible sites for a dam and storage reservoir in the Allegheny and the Monongahela, and this includes a dam site 10 miles south of the New York border that is a place you can build a dam, and it would back up a 25-mile reservoir behind it well onto Seneca land. And for a number of reasons, mostly because the site was as good as any of the engineering, and also because, no surprise to Congress and the Corps and the city, this looked like the cheapest, easiest political place to park a dam and a storage reservoir than any of the other sites. Kinzua eventually authorizes the Corps to build the dam at the site that was chosen. And build it the Corps did, and here it is, Kinzua Dam. And the name is an affront to begin with because Kinzua is a Seneca word for spearfish, and yet they named the dam Kinzua. It was also a town there called Kinzua. The Corps builds this. And remember the line that I had you read before from the 1794 treaty, that the United States will never claim the land nor disturb the Seneca Nation in the free use and enjoyment thereof. It shall remain theirs until they choose to sell the same to the people of the United States. Well, not so much. Nobody, not the Corps, not Congress, not the city of Pittsburgh, nobody ever asked the Seneca for their permission to park a reservoir on their land. And basically, Congress simply authorized the Corps to design and build the project and provided the funding, including funds to condemn the lands for the project. The Corps started on the work kind of in the 50s, but they really didn't get started until 1960. And then they built this and closed the gates on it in 64. So this was built in 64. And the Seneca, they resisted every possible way they could. They lobbied, they petitioned, they hired people to lobby and petition, and then they litigated. The Senecas actually filed a claim in federal court to say, hey, we've got a treaty that's a binding legal agreement between sovereign nations that you will not take our land without our permission. And the federal courts disagreed and actually ruled. And it's the plenary power doctrine. It drives me nuts. That Congress has the plenary power to abrogate a treaty no matter what. If they want to do it, they can. Congress did not even mention the treaty. The Seneca Nation, besides arguing that the treaty actually prohibited it, they actually tried a second argument, which is, okay, if Congress has the power to abrogate the treaty, at least they should have to say so. They should be explicit that they're abrogating a treaty with another nation in 1794. And the federal courts didn't even give them that. I don't think this decision would come out this way now, but maybe I'm wrong. But man, it was a federal court and then an appellate court decision. So they didn't get litigated. And they actually even tried to get involved in presidential politics because the dam hadn't been built yet. In the 1960 campaign between Nixon and Kennedy, Kennedy came to Western New York. They got time with him. Seneca Nation got time with Kennedy, told him about the problem. Kennedy promised them that if he were elected, he would look into it and reconsider the decision. And then he gets elected, and as the story goes, and I think it's probably pretty accurate, he doesn't ask the Corps, he asks Harold Ickes, who's his Secretary of Interior, who was his main advisor on natural resource issues, what do I do? And basically Ickes advised him, this thing's already a done deal. It's already been authorized, it's gonna happen, it's not worth the time. And so he didn't do anything, and it got built. And I will tell you what, you go to Seneca Nation, they don't like a lot of the politicians at the time, but they particularly dislike Kennedy and Harold Ickes, who is kind of funny because you think of Ickes as the Secretary of Interior, was very prominent in protection of things, and they're not happy. So this next one is you have to talk a little bit about the effect of Kinzua Dam on Seneca, and here's why. The Corps condemned what's called a flowage easement. They took flowage easement over 1/3 of the Seneca land, or 10,000 acres out of the 30,000. But the trouble is, the 10,000 acres they took were all in the lower part of the land, right where they had their fields, their homes, and their towns. So they basically took most of the river bottom where the Seneca were living, where they had their, like I say, towns and farms. They had their longhouses and their cemeteries. And the Seneca towns and fields couldn't remain. They had to leave, and the people had to leave. The Corps actually built them 2 new towns. They're called new towns, Jimmerstown and Steenburg, and essentially relocated everybody to these 2 towns away from the river and up in the upper part of it. They displaced more than 600 people. They took almost all the fertile farmland that was in the area. It was devastating to the basic economy and the life of the Seneca. Congress appropriated eventually $15 million to pay for the condemnation and the relocation, and it was a pittance compared to the financial benefit that Pittsburgh got. All right, so contrast here real quick. This is a picture from in the 50s in Seneca land just before, so you don't see the fields and stuff. It's kind of a bad angle, and I couldn't find any that were of Seneca that showed, but it shows you kind of the river. This is what it looks like now in the area where it was taken. So it's a parked reservoir on this land. So that's painful that it is, but there are 4 things that made it even worse. And so the first is, and this is the worst one I think, to make sure the Seneca would leave and not come back to their fields and towns and homes. When the Corps moved the people out, it burned their houses and it burned their towns. And it is not lost on the Seneca Nation that 180 years after the U.S. Army burned their towns, they burned them again. And this is still in living memory of a lot of people who live there. So second, and I got to go back to this. So if you look at this map, it's a little hard to tell, but it shows here 2 things. It shows the normal pool elevation of the flood control river, and it shows a maximum pool elevation. So the normal pool took a lot of the land, but the maximum pool elevation takes a lot more. It takes a big chunk of the land in the Seneca area. The trouble is, never in the 50+ years that dam has been there has the Corps needed to go to maximum pool elevation for flood control. It's just never had a water year that's even needed close to it. They haven't even been close to it. So that means there's a lot of land out there that was taken that's never wet. It's never got a reservoir on it. You can walk it. You can visit it. I had a man who took me and he visited his grandfather's farm and their lands. And yet the land's taken, they can't use it. They can look at it, but they can't use it. So that really irritates a lot of people quite a bit as well. Third thing is that somehow during this whole process of condemnation, the Corps coming in and doing this, the Corps then allowed the state of New York to build the Southern Tier Expressway across Seneca land. Basically authorized the building of a road there that's now Interstate 86. And again, nobody asked the Seneca if they wanted a major highway parked right across their land, and it took more of their land. The only good thing about it is, if anybody knows the Seneca, when they have a dispute with New York, they set tires fire, and they stand there with guns and they shut down the freeway. So they do that every once in a while, but still, again, they're burdened there. And then fourth, and you're probably trying to figure out how I got involved. Fourth was this. Remember, Congress authorized this project for 2 purposes: flood control and water quality, basically augmentation and dilution. In essence, if you think about it, the U.S. Is solving a flood problem in a wealthy area, downtown Pittsburgh, by parking the floodwaters in a poor area upriver. And it's also solving a water contamination problem, not by getting people to stop the contamination of the source, but by parking water on the upriver area to be used. But when the Corps authorized the project, it was actually asked, should we also include hydropower in this project? And hydropower, the Corps said at the time that adding hydropower to Kinzua Dam would not be in the national interest, and no, we don't think you should. So they weren't authorized to provide hydropower. However, after the Corps had the authorization began of the project, a Pennsylvania utility saw this as an opportunity and filed a license application to the Federal Power Commission to build a non-federal pump storage hydropower project. And there it is. That's a pump storage project. The U.S. did not object. It wasn't going to add it itself, but it allowed it allowed a utility to add it. FERC, it's now FERC, it was Federal Power Commission at that time, licensed it in 1965. And they called the damn thing the Seneca Pump Storage Project. I mean, I think that's even worse than the Kinzua Dam, is that the Pennsylvania utility company, now First Energy, has the Seneca Pump Storage Project. It was authorized in 1965. It has 450 megawatts of peaking power. It's very valuable, and it's earned the power company, utility company, millions and millions of dollars over the years as well. All right. So, and this, you're probably wondering, this is part 3. How did I get involved? And I got involved because of this. Federal Power Commission FERC licenses last 50 years. And this license for this pump storage project was going to come due in 2015. And we've seen elsewhere in the country that Indian nations have actually gone after Federal Power Commission licenses for hydropower projects that burden their lands and their waters. The idea being, if we can't get rid of it, at least if somebody's going to be making money, the benefit ought to go to the tribes and their people. So Salish Kootenai tribe, Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes in northwest Montana have now taken over the license for Kerr Dam on the Flathead River. And on the Deschutes, Warm Springs now jointly own the license for the Pelton Roundview project with PGE and their historic territories. So it's a thing. It's a developing kind of a concept in certain places. And the Seneca had a decision to make when the license was coming up. Should they compete for the license for the Seneca pump storage project? And there's a lot of, the whole idea of becoming entangled in this dam and in this project was really hard for a lot of the Seneca people, because I read the interviews. They had a lot of internal soul searching, a lot of anxiety, a lot of conflict over the idea whether to even get involved. But in the end, the Seneca government at the time decided to compete. They created what was called the Kinzua Dam Relicensing Commission as an agency of the Seneca government. And the agency then hired engineers and power consultants and biologists and lawyers, everybody you can think of, because it's very expensive. They budgeted, $500,000 a year to try to compete for a license for a major federal power project, non-federal power project. And that's how I got asked to help. And I got asked to help not by the Seneca themselves and not even by their main outside counsel. I was basically lawyers hired me as a specialist. And the reason they came and found me was because it did in fact link all the things I do. It linked the fact I was an expert on the Indian Reserve water rights doctrine, and I did it not from a legal perspective, because people who work in winters rights, it's become a very narrow specialty about Western water and irrigation. But I'd studied the history and the context, and I had a much more sort of creative use that you could use of the doctrine. So they found me for that. But I was also familiar with big river projects. I do hydropower. I mean, we know hydropower. I know dams. I know fish and wildlife. I'd worked with FERC and the Corps. So I was actually perfectly positioned. It was kind of luck they found me, but I was perfectly positioned to help. So I got to be part of the team. And the Seneca did file a competing license application in 2010. And the application itself includes this bare kind of legal assertion that the Seneca have reserve water rights based on their 1794 treaty, something nobody had thought, argued before, and based on the treaty and the historic use of the land, rights that had been burdened by the Corps but never fully taken, and particularly had never been legally transferred to a non-federal power company. And behind that, we didn't have to say anything else in the license application. Behind that, there was, one of the big, long piece of significant legal analysis and historical analysis I put together, which I'm quite proud of, and it's confidential, so nobody can see it. But I love the copy I have, and I carry it around with me all the time. And not only that, I actually built into this not only a theory about how you could get the license, but then how you could leverage the license and force the Corps. You couldn't force the Corps to take out the dam, but I think there was a potential you could actually, over time, force the Corps to change the way it operated and at least reduce the footprint and give up on some of the maximum pool elevation. It would have required rethinking some of the risk profile for Pittsburgh, but I think you could have done it. And so once we got this thing developed and we got the license application filed, my part was done. They asked me to do this and they were going to carry it on. But I was sort of looking forward to watching what was going to be a 10-year nasty fight over this thing, because I'm sure it was going to be. And I also thought there might become a time when they'd need me again. And then that's where politics get in the way. And Seneca politics are as brutal as any politics anywhere. And for reasons that are fairly obvious, there were very different feelings within the nation about even whether to do this. And so when I was there, the group that was the president and the counselors were in favor of pursuing the relicensing. 2 years after I was out of the project, a different group got elected into power who were very much not happy with the idea. And they thought about it and they decided to unwind what had gotten started. And then First Energy, the utility that had the rights to it, came in and basically said that they would actually start sharing some of the economic benefits of the project with the nation if the nation would pull the license application. And they eventually did. And you know, for all I know, it was a very good deal for the nation. I wasn't part of it, and I don't begrudge them. It's such a horrible history with this thing. I don't begrudge whatever path they decided to take. But all of a sudden, it was gone. And you know, and I still always wondered if we'd pressed on, what could have been the outcome here in the long run. So it by about 2013 or so, this had melted away. But it was an important, I think, effort even for what it is. And again, I've never known quite what to do with it, so I stuck it away in the back of my head till now. So this is giving me a chance to talk about it. All right, so there's one. It's got time, we're going to do a second one here, which is the Yukon River. This is in Alaska, part of the Yukon River, and we'll go to this slide now. So the Yukon River, it's an international river. It's the 4th largest drainage basin in North America. It's the 3rd longest river in North America. It stretches nearly 2,000 miles from northern BC and the Yukon Territory across Alaska to the Bering Sea. It is one of the least populated river basins anywhere you could be in. It's only about 100,000 people live in the whole basin, and almost all of those are in 3 towns, Whitehorse and Dawson in Yukon Territory, and in Fairbanks, which is not really even part of the basin. It's a southern tributary and you know, the rest of it is small communities across the river. It's also one of the world's longest free-flowing rivers. The only dam is a little dam up near Whitehorse. The rest of it, there's no dams anywhere on the system. It's also the world's longest inland Pacific salmon run. So it's isolated and sparsely populated. And I forget who I was talking about with this. I think it was with Marcia. It's especially in Alaska, but it's not wilderness. It is the least wilderness experience I've ever had on a major river, because it is just a continual string of small communities, fish camps, fishing areas, you know, human population activity all the way down the river. So it was a very interesting experience to be up there, and I was up there a number of times. You're feeling very isolated from the rest of the world, and you can't get into most of it, especially in Alaska, other by air or by river. But you're not in a wilderness area. You know, you're in bears, but you're also in communities at the same time. So it was an interesting experience. It's subsistence hunting and fishing is still very much the mainstay of these communities in the area. And you know, so that's the only connection is getting there by that. So this is the map. There's another version of how big it is. You know, if you superimpose it on the US, the thing sucker's a big basin. Now, and here's just a couple pictures. This just gives you an idea. I mean, we're just in the middle of nowhere, and you come along to a couple of fish wheels, you come to a fish camp. That's life in the Alaskan part of the Yukon. So from our perspective, of course, the river's pretty darn clean. It's the cleanest river I've ever been along because it's not that many population. But from their perspective, it's not. From their perspective, there's serious water quality problems. And the problems are many, but they mainly are legacy mines, because there's a lot of mining in the Yukon, if you think about it. A lot of modern mining, especially in the Yukon side, so there's a lot of issues about mining. There's a lot of legacy military sites. There are more little podunk radar Air Force base sites that are full of oil drums and stuff. And then their own communities. Their own communities are poor, and their sewage treatment plants and their sewage treatment facilities and their town dumps are a serious source of contamination. So First Nations and tribal leaders got together in 1997 for the first time in Galena. From the entire river came together to talk about it, and they eventually persuaded their own little First Nation and tribal governments, some aren't so little, to form an organization, the Yukon River InterTribal Watershed Council. And it is 73 members. 15 of them are First Nations in Yukon. The other 50 plus are Alaskan tribal communities. And I love it. They got a great, simple 50-year vision to be able to drink water directly from the Yukon River. And then the mission statement is, I think, a good one. We, the indigenous tribes and First Nations from the headwaters of the mouth, have been placed here by a Creator, do hereby agree to initiate and continue the cleanup and preservation of the Yukon River for the protection of our own and future generations, for the continuation of our traditional native way of life. So that's the Yukon River InterTribal Watershed Council, and they have it's an incredibly small organization. It's got like 10 people for a 2,000 huge river basin, who, small staff, almost no resources. And they do get some excellent in-kind participation, partnership help, and especially give a cheer here to the USGS, who's given people's time to help. But other than that, it's a small organization. And for 20 years, they focused on 3 things in particular: water quality monitoring and kind of accumulating the data, Second is what we think of as backhaul and cleanup, basically just helping to arrange cleanups and cleanup everywhere they can in the basin. And then the third is essentially training and public education, training members of their own community to be an indigenous network of water quality monitoring up and down the river and learn how to do these other things. And then they have a leadership summit every 2 years. And they trade it back and forth between First Nation Yukon side and the Alaska side where they meet and sort of gather and think about how the organization's going. And that's how I got involved. I got involved for the 2011 summit in Ruby, Alaska. The leadership of the Watershed Council came together. They wanted to have their summit. They wanted to focus on what are we doing? And by that I mean they'd been 15 years at it now. They'd accumulated some great data. They were doing some pit by pit cleanup, but they're trying to think, where's this going? What role do we have? What can we do in the river eventually? How can we have a say in the governance? Is there a larger government policy purpose here? And again, some of this is just luck of knowing people, but again, it just it united everything I do into one sort of big package, and that is, again, big rivers and how you manage them, how you plan for them, water quality, legal rights, Aboriginal water. I know more about Canadian Aboriginal water rights than almost any American has a right to know. It just fit everything. And then people who knew people involved in it, and they asked me to bring a small legal and policy team up and spend a couple of days with them talking about kind of where they are. What is it? I got to canoe the river for almost a month. And so it just was a phenomenal long trip. And we ended the canoe trip in Ruby, Alaska, right here where they were going to have the summit. And the summit, we had 2 days in a small high school gym with about 200 people. 40 plus of them were delegates from each of the members sitting at a table. So we were in a high school gym. So here's 2 pictures. One of them, that's the gym where we were meeting in 2011 in Ruby. The man talking is Carl Sidney. He's a Teslin First Nation, so he was a Canadian co-chair of the Watershed Council. The other one, I love this picture. This is Clarence Alexander. He's Fort Yukon. He was the Alaska side co-chair of the Watershed Council, who a couple years later gets an award from President Obama, Presidential Medal of Freedom. So I had to throw that picture in. It's one that we love very much. Now this was supposed to be a one-shot deal. Come up there for a couple of days, and it turned into 4 years of a wild ride for me. And so the story to begin with was pretty grim. We devoted the first morning to talking about what they don't have. And what they don't have any rights. They don't have any right to govern that we think of traditionally. And that's because of what's called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1960. Now it says it's a settlement, but by God, it's not a settlement. It was just basically imposed on the Native peoples in Alaska. They fought, they organized, they did what they could to get the best bill they possibly did. What the Native Claims Settlement Act did was extinguish Aboriginal rights to both land and water in Alaska, and basically strip tribal governments of any sort of governing powers over resources at all. The Alaska tribes virtually have no say in any legal sense in governing the river. So Yukon side a little different. There are some rights to water and participation in government that we'll talk about, but still it was potential that was far from realized. And none of this, you weren't going to have any, if there wasn't some way to get them some role in the governance of the river, all this work was not going to come to much. And that was the morning. The morning was a real downer. I mean, it was a tough time talking about this. And then we took lunch and we just sort of tossed out the book and just said, okay, so what? What do we do anyway? And I had a person I was working with named Marilyn Ferris from Winnipeg, who was on the Canadian side, an expert in Aboriginal water rights and governance. And she and I had the same focus, so we combined it. And it was what we just called the just do it principle. And by that, what we basically said, and we had an interaction with the leadership and just said, screw it, we're governments. We want to have a say in river governance and what the water quality, let's just start doing what governments do and then demand a seat at the table. And whatever it is, let's do that. And it was funny, it just, the whole afternoon switched, and it was this moment where we basically talked about, we had the data, we had the information, we cared, we were organized, let's just do it. And at the end of the day, somebody motioned for a motion that we become, and here's the quote, aggressively assert our proper role in governance of the river to protect water quality. And it passed in just a rousing cheers and everybody screaming and yelling, and it was just this intensely emotional moment. And then they looked at me and they said, okay, what does that mean? And it really was about that. I mean, they kind of knew, but we hadn't really talked about, okay, what do we do? And so I was fresh from the Northwest, where two very important things had been happening in the last few years related to water quality. And one of them is what, if you know anything about the Clean Water Act, where the federal government sets a set of guidance and standards, but they delegate to the states then to set standards. Well, tribes under certain circumstances can be treated as states. It's called treated as a state status, TAS status. And it's where tribes are given the authority to develop water quality regulations and standards within their territories and then implement them just like a state. So that's one. The other was in Oregon itself, there had been pressure on the state of Oregon, especially from some of the tribes in Oregon, Umatilla tribe, Warm Springs in particular, about basically improving the water quality standards, especially for toxic contaminants, based on a much more realistic understanding of what fish consumption rates are and how people who actually live with the rivers use rivers. You should have a very different set of toxic standards we had. And Oregon had just passed the nation's most stringent water quality standards based on this. So this is great. You know, we didn't have any authority in the Clean Water Act in Alaska to be treated as state status, and we weren't the state of Alaska, and they didn't want to listen to the tribes anyway. So we sat there and created a follow-on resolution that the summit then voted on the next day, and was to just do that, do this. Basically spend the next 2 years developing a Yukon River watershed plan and bring it to the 2013 summit, which is going to be in Mayo, Yukon, and for review and possible consideration. And here's what was to be in the plan. Water quality standards for the entire river, including model water codes and standards each tribe and First Nation could adopt. A plan that would combine traditional environmental knowledge of the tribes and First Nations with the science that we were developing through the Watershed Council staff. The watershed plan had to be designed to meet the vision and mission of the Watershed Council. So remember, you know, we got to drink from the water in 50 years, et cetera. And work for people, communities, fish, animals, plants, and maintain their way of subsistence life. And then they also said we were going to develop and include it in a governance strategy. So what would it matter if we developed the plan and standards if we couldn't? So how do you leverage where you are now to some governance of the river? That was going to be in the plan. And then they I swear, just like the day before, they turned to me and said, now you're going to do this, aren't you? Or help us in developing. I wasn't going to decide it, but I was going to work on it. I said, sure, sign me up. And again, it's an organization without any money, so I didn't get paid a whole lot on it for the next few years. I put more work into this thing over the next 2 years. We went to Mayo 2 years later, so I just gave you some pictures. This is from the Yukon side of the Yukon River. That's a couple of different places. And then we were in Mayo. This is a water ceremony where they came down after they approved the watershed plan. They came down and had a ceremony by the river. And this is what was approved. And you can find this still. It's a Yukon River watershed plan. And it is exactly all those things we talked about. It starts with the mission statement of the Watershed Council, then it has objectives based on that, and it's got a set of the best water quality standards you can find anywhere that I pulled from the work in the Northwest and the tribes and from EPA and from the Canadian Council ministers and from our own folks. And one of the things I learned how to do working for the Yukon Watershed Council is project ourselves as very big. It was like 2 scientists and me, and we made ourselves look like we were a legal team and you know, everything you could. I got very good at looking like we had really powerful consultants and powerful legal team behind us. And I also besides the water quality standards that were in it, I actually came up with, man, you know, it's funny to do this because I was really proud of this part. We came up with a governance strategy for both sides of the international border. So we have to start with the Alaska side. And this is the last part of the talk. It'll take a few minutes to go through this. So if I remember what I said about ANCSA, it stripped native peoples of any water rights in the Yukon River. But at the same time, the federal government in 1980, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA, where the federal government took a bunch of federal land and Congress designated these lands as wildlife refuges, national parks, in particular, and they designated them at this time. You can see, look how extensive this is. That's mostly wildlife refuges. So half the Yukon in Alaska is wildlife refuges. And they're designated for these purposes: protect fish and wildlife, protect water quality, protect a subsistence way of life. Exactly the purposes that match the purpose of the Watershed Council and the people that we work with. And then there was even some litigation called the Katie John case, where the Native American Rights Fund took some of the tribal communities and individuals and litigated the concept of, are there federal water rights that go along with your designation? So I did the studies of Indian reserve water rights, but for those who know anything about it, there's a doctrine of federal reserve water rights. The federal government designates land for a particular purpose. Those lands carry with them basically water rights related to the purposes. And the federal courts said, yeah, it looks like they probably are. So we took that and ran with it. Basically created a legal strategy that said, okay, there may not be Indian water rights, but there are federal water rights that are there precisely for what we want on the river. And so the target then would become the Department of Interior. And the first thing was basically convincing the Department of Interior that their water rights were morally and historically the Alaskan tribes' water rights. They were the water rights that these tribes would have if an INCSA hadn't stripped them of Aboriginal rights to water. And so the first part of it was, you folks have our water rights, basically. So let's talk about that. Second part of the strategy then was to try to persuade Interior to manage these waters to protect water quality, fish and wildlife, exactly the purposes already in ANILCA, but to do it consistent with the vision, objectives, and standards in our plan. We got the plan for you guys. We got the standards, what it means to manage these waters for water quality and whatever. And actually, when we wrote the plan, I designed it to match their purposes exactly. So here's the purpose under ANILCA, here's the standard that goes with that purpose, and things like that. So then the third piece was to persuade Interior they could actually cooperate with our federally we're very tiny, small communities, but they're all federally recognized tribes, even though they don't have any water rights or land rights. Persuade them they could cooperate with us and the tribe's designated water quality agency, the Watershed Council. And I even wrote up a thing for Interior that showed how they had authority under certain various obscure provisions of law that to cooperate with the communities there. We also knew the feds would want to see that the plan was not just the councils, because the council's not a tribe, it's an organization that's a combined of them. And they'd want to see that the federally recognized tribes themselves had approved this. So we actually developed a model ordinance that we were going to ship around all the little communities and have all their tribal governments approve it, that approved the watershed plan and said it was ours. So we had this thing all together. We kind of figured if we got Interior, Alaska didn't want to talk to anybody. We figured if we got Interior, eventually Alaska would come along too, at least want to talk. And also we knew Alaska someday's got to improve their water quality standards, and we'd be ready. We'd have the standards in the plan. So here's where we got to. October 2014, we got a meeting with Secretary Jewell. We got in the Interior office, that's Clarence Alexander, our Alaskan co-chair. I'm not the only one there, there's a few others, but I got in the picture. We got a meeting with Interior. We got a promise from Interior they would work with us. We got assigned staff. We got assigned one of the solicitors to work with us. And nobody bought into it yet, but it was like, oh, this looks really cool. Let's work together. And then it all goes away, and I'll tell you why it all goes away. But we got to this point. We got this far. But before I do that, I got to then switch to the Yukon side. So I got to talk about the Yukon side. The Yukon side, in the Yukon First Nations area, there actually was a modern set of treaty making. There's no treaties in the 19th century, but they did a modern set of treaty makings in the 1990s. So there was between the 15 First Nations, the Yukon Territory, and the nation of Canada, there's an agreement, and there's what's called the Umbrella Final Agreement was signed, and then they tiered off of that all these land settlement claims for each particular First Nation. And it has the best statement of indigenous water rights anywhere in the world. So read this thing. The Yukon First Nation has the right to have water which is on or flowing through or adjacent to its settlement land remain substantially unaltered as to quantity, quality, and rate of flow. So a standard of water right that you have the right to have this water remain substantially unaltered. The trouble was, not much had happened with this since it had adopted in the 1990s. And all the decision-making and governance structures in Yukon weren't really consistent with what the rights were. And not only that, Yukon government is very conservative, and they were mostly interested in promoting mining and not working with people about water quality. So a lot of dissatisfaction in the First Nations with the Yukon government in this. But this is a great description of a water right. And like on the Alaska side, I don't have the best map for this, but this is a map of Yukon Territory, and these are overlapping historical claims, and they're not the same as the settlement claim. The settlement lands are smaller, but they still, like on the Alaska side, where the federal reservations cover much of the land. The the First Nations settlement areas cover about half the basin in the Yukon. It's huge. And so if you actually implement these water rights there, you've got the basis already for some sort of shared co-governance of the river just on this basis. And one thing that I discovered was that the First Nations had land ordinances, but none of them had water ordinances. And I would have done this in the 90s, right after the treaty was signed. I would have passed something that said, here's what we mean by substantially unaltered. Here's how we're going to implement this. They didn't, but that meant that we had a gap to fill. And again, we designed the watershed plan to exactly match the statement of the water rights. In fact, that statement about the river to be substantially unaltered as to quantity, quality, and flow was our general objective, general water quality standard. And then all of the specific standards for each contaminant were linked to this is what we mean. In the interim, and we made it sure it was interim so it didn't lock them in forever, but for now, these water quality standards match this objective. So we included specific government contaminant standards to match the standard. We also designed model water quality legislation for each First Nation to adopt that would then implement, would internalize and implement the water plan and the water quality standards. We included in them an expression of their water rights, expression of their river governance power. We included additional provisions on how the First Nations were going to enforce the standards in their area, how they were going to work with Yukon and Canada to make sure what happened there, what they would do in their lands wouldn't undermine our water rights. I mean, it was a great strategy. And so we built this, and so if you remember in October 2014 on the US side, we're back in Interior. Well, in November 2014, I'm up in Whitehorse, about to meet with all the First Nations, and then a separate set of meetings with Yukon Territory where we're going to start pulling the trigger on this thing. And this one really had power. I swear this one, with Interior, it was more like we had to persuade them. Here, if they didn't do what we wanted, we had the basis for a long-term litigation strategy for co-management. And it's just about to go. And God love him, and Trudy's here, she remembers this moment. The whole organization fell apart on me when I was flying to Whitehorse. When I took off, I had an organization. When I landed, it was gone. And basically had nothing to do with the work I was doing. Internally, they fell apart. There was mismanagement. There was limited amount of funds. The Yukon side and the Canadian side and the Yukon Territory side and the Alaska side, the leadership fell out and they just completely collapsed. And all of a sudden I'm being asked by the Yukon First Nations to be their lawyer in a dispute with the Alaska side. I said, that's not what I got hired for. I'm not your lawyer. I'm your water rights consultant. And it fell apart, completely just fell off the map. And so the organization has retrenched. Now it does exist still again. They took a while to reconfigure themselves. They've got a very small staff now, about 5 or 6 again. All they do is water quality monitoring and a little bit of backhaul, and they're sort of building this back up again. And this potential just went away. It just sits on the shelf somewhere. And part of it was because, as I said, I was able to project bigness. I projected that there was really quite a team working on it. It was really just me. And I was persuading a lot of people that it was going somewhere. And I still don't quite understand why the First Nations haven't picked it up fully. And I think they will eventually. But I'm having a hard time. This is the first time I've really been able to talk about this at this length, because this one really, I put a lot of myself into it, and I'm trying to stay away. At moments like it's not about me, and it wasn't. It was about them, and it was their plan in the end, and they approved it. But I put a lot of thought into this thing, and it was just a great piece of work. And it was the sum total of everything I've done for the last 30 years, including what I did here, and then what I've done since. And so there's no better opportunity than to ask me to come down and talk about this, because I'm now kind of coming to grips. I don't think the Seneca piece I can write up, because that was very particularly confidential, but I could write this up, so I need to actually turn this into something. I'm not quite sure how, but this gives me the opportunity to do that. And that's it. Thank you very much, and so appreciate it. Oh, just a few more pictures from the Yukon. Look at the size of that frickin' river, and that's mid-August. That's low flow. And then this is just from camps along the way. More water wheels, a bunch of them from various places. And the canoe journeys, all the canoes had this on the healing journey from the Watershed Council. One of the funny things is we canoed the river nobody in the Yukon canoes. All the people actually lived there thought we were nuts because, you know, it takes forever to go anywhere and it's a big river. Why would you canoe when you could ride, when you can, all the boats on the Yukon look like that pretty much. And we had our little canoes going downriver. Anyway, thank you very, very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this. Sure, I'll talk about this all day. Yeah.
So my research is on the balance in the River Docks, and I wondered how much that factored into this water quality plan up in Alaska in terms of the Anoka settlement and the federal.
Yeah. Yeah, so the main stem isn't, but there are chunks of some of the, like the porcupine and some of the others, only in the sense of that just added more weight to the fact that the federal government has control over the river in ways that particularly perfectly match up with what we're trying to do. So, you know, in the plan, I don't even know if we mentioned it, but it was just part of it was the sum total. The best thing was the wildlife refuge designations, but every other federal designation possible that could give weight to this thing, we included in it. So yeah, it would be part of it as well. So, anything else? Yeah, Daniel.
John, did you have, before the internal disputes erupted in both of the cases, did you have a sense they were coming? Or?
Yeah, a little bit. I'd been up there. I'd been asked to come up to Fairbanks about maybe 6 months before, where we were having an executive committee meeting with leadership, and I got there a day early, and I went to dinner with Clarence and some of the other tribal leaders, and they spent the entire time grousing about the guy running the organization, and I thought, you know, this isn't good. And he's a good friend too. They're all good friends. They were trying to do too much with almost no resources, and yeah, I knew there was a problem. I didn't expect to get off the plane and find it had fallen apart though, because I've kind of figured we'd kept it on a shoestring for 3 years. So it was going to keep that way, but no, it didn't. And so everybody, you know, I got letters and calls from all of them saying, it's not about you, we love the work you did, we'd love to keep it going, but, you know, sort of thing. So it just went away. And this is, you know, it's two different stories about politics really, because politics are so brutal, especially in smaller, tougher, poorer communities. They're even more brutal than they are in rich communities, so it's tough stuff. So anyway, anything else? Oh, well, thank you very, very much. Oh, well, yeah, go ahead.
Do you know if there are any legal remedies with respect to water resources that might come into play at Alaska?
You mean like the pipeline? Actually, Jeff had mentioned this as well. I have never looked at that specifically, so I don't know what the treaty basis exactly for some of those nations along there are, but I know they're essentially arguing that there are, although when you read about the litigation that was filed, there's religious freedom claims, there's NEPA claims and stuff, and there aren't a lot of reserve water rights or treaty rights claims. They're not making them, so.
It's curious.
I throw everything in the kitchen sink if I were them, so I'd probably include that, but maybe they're afraid of getting a ruling that would not be good. I mean, yeah. 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 Yeah, so it may be that just there's enough other pieces that if they don't go, this wouldn't go either. So no, not that I know. But I think that's the best part of it. I mean, you can get creative and shape this region. As much as the Winner's Doctrine is a very powerful tool, Indian Reserve water rights, it has been narrowed very distinctly in its actual application from what it originally could have been. So it's all about Western tribes who were forced under reservations and forced into treaties that talk about irrigation, and so it's all about irrigation. And you know, when we were starting in on the Seneca work, we hired consultants from Fort Collins, great consultants, water rights folks, who when we started talking about this, they said, well, is there practical irrigable acreage in the Seneca land? You know, how can there be a water right if you're not irrigating? I said, there's more to this than just irrigating land, you know. And so even the consultants don't quite get it. And I knew we would have trouble litigating it. I went to, they had the 100th anniversary of the Winner's Doctrine in 2008. They had a Winner's case. They had a big meeting of it in a big centennial celebration of the winner's case in New Mexico. And it was a room full of 500 people who went to this thing. And they had me come speak, and I was the only one there who wasn't, somebody actively working in Western water settlement issues. And so I gave a talk about how the dam thing had been way narrowed, and it really was a much broader conception you could be using, and they all laughed and smiled and went on their way. So it is things for people finding hard to figure out how to use. But I don't know, I bet we could figure out something and add the Missouri mix. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, Marcia.
Do you think that this plan that you wrote as great
Personal
love
cost.
or love, will they be able to just resurrect that?
Yeah, I think so. The potential, especially on the Yukon side, the potential of the water, the statement of the water right in the treaty, when you combine with the land coverage they have, I'm not sure why they haven't done it already anyway. So yeah, it's still there. The potential is, that's why I really should write it up, because I think it is, somebody could make use of it. And whenever I talk to anybody, we went down to Teslin, one of the First Nations, and talked to the staff there and their own in-house counsel. And they said, wow, this looks like it could really work, so let's figure out a way to do it. But then they lost the momentum, so now they've got a lot of problems. Their main issues are trying to fight off mine claims, and this could help, but there's not enough time actually to do this work and then bring it to bear. They're just trying to fight off the mines as it is. Plus, climate change has hit Yukon hard. Its permafrost loss is huge, and so there's not much water rights can do to solve permafrost problems. So that's actually also another focus they have. Yeah.
Big question, maybe you could quickly respond. I think the conventional wisdom in a lot of circles is the tribes with treaty rights generally fare better than native entities who don't have treaty rights, and I don't know if you agree or disagree.
Well, particularly when you look at Alaska, I definitely agree, because in Alaska they got stripped of rights completely. But even in the Northwest, you have the ones with treaty rights, and then there's some with executive order tribes in the Upper Columbia. And let's put it this way, less money has been spent mitigating their fish and wildlife damage for those nations than for the ones with treaty rights. And so it's become it's gotten better over the last few years, but yeah, I think it's a historical accident that some have treaties and some don't, and the ones that do, it gives you a bigger whack. It also gives you something that you are afraid to use at times. So sometimes the lower river tribes in the Columbia with treaty rights, they'll bring them to bear in certain places, but other places they won't. They'll just bring claims like in Missouri because they're afraid of getting a ruling that their treaty rights don't connect to that. But usually they do, and for those who do know anything about it, what's called the Culvert case. Anybody here know anything about that? So in the Northwest, you've got the treaty fishing rights for both in the Columbia and the Puget Sound, and the original decisions, what it basically says is the tribes have the right to take fish in common with the other citizens in the state. And the original litigation was just about access to the river, because people started shutting the tribes off from the river. So the original litigation in 1905 and then in the 40s was all about the court saying, no, this right gives you access to the river. Just because somebody has private property they've taken up, they can't keep you from your fishing rights. So that was part one. But what good is access to the river if there's no fish to catch? So part two of the litigation in the 60s and 70s, the famous Bolt decision and all the fights were about, okay, how much of the fish in the river are allocated to tribes? And basically the U.S. Supreme Court eventually said, at least at this stage, they're allowed the opportunity to catch half the fish, and the state can't set. So what was going on was the state and the federal government were both putting in hatcheries and setting fishing seasons that allowed all the fish to be caught in the lower river, and none of them were getting up above Bonneville Dam into Zone 6, which is the fishing rights for the tribes. So the court's decision said, not only do you have a right of access to the river, you have a right of access to half the fish. Third obvious question, what good is that if there's no fish left because of other things? So included in litigation has been the idea that the treaty right to fish actually carries with it essentially a version of an environmental servitude, meaning not only can you not keep them from the river, not only can you not prevent them from taking out fish, but you can't screw the river up so bad there's no fish there. And nobody thought, everybody gets worried it's going to be used to take out the dams in Columbia, and I don't think it's going to do that. But what it did do is they looked for the right fact situation, and they filed suit against the state of Washington, because the state of Washington, like everywhere else, every road that anybody ever made, they put in culverts, and the culverts block fish passage. So all over the state of Washington, you've got all these small streams that historically had fish passage up into places where people would fish or that were good spawning for fish that are now been blocked by road building and culverts. And they sued, and because you have a powerful treaty right there, the federal court in Washington ruled a few years ago, those culverts are a violation of the treaty. And the state of Washington went, what? What? I said, yeah, those are a violation of the treaty. So now let's go to the remedy section. And so they began a 2-year litigation, and eventually the court hit them with an injunction order that will require the state of Washington to spend hundreds of millions of dollars fixing every culvert in salmon-bearing streams. And the state of Washington went, what? It's one thing to lose the ruling, it's another thing to actually bite into the state budget, into the hundreds of millions to the billions of dollars. And they are now sitting with a court order requiring them to do that. And they appealed it to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit looked at it and said, yeah, it looks good to us. So that just came out. This case is going to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now we'll see if the court takes it, but they're going to take it there. So that I think it's a good example of what you can do. I cannot imagine the Spokane tribe, for example, without a treaty right, being able to get that kind of leverage. But it does bring us to I could have done a whole separate presentation about one of the most interesting things happening right now in the Columbia, and that is Grand Coulee Dam blocked salmon passage in the upper Columbia. And for as long as I've been involved in this work, people have talked about getting salmon back over Grand Coulee, but everybody has always said, well, it's a pipe dream. And it may be a pipe dream, but the tribes in the upper Columbia have decided it's their pipe dream, and they have forced into the conversation, into the Columbia River Treaty conversation, and into the work we do, measures requiring the study of bringing anadromous fish back to the upper Columbia. And I had to basically beat my council over the head to include a provision in the last program that would say that, but that's because that's what they want. And then we went looking to Bonneville for money to fund this, and God, that was Bonneville spends hundreds of millions of dollars in the fish program, and we struggled for 2 years to get a $100,000 habitat assessment of the habitat above Grand Coulee just to begin this. So it's going to be, the wrong administration just got voted into office for this one, let's put it this way. But it's fascinating, because I still don't know whether it's in the long run really symbolic or not, but man, it's a big, powerful issue that's all of a sudden taken hold of everybody. People who don't care about the particulars of it get real excited when you talk about fish back over Grand Coulee. And I think we're talking, the Hanford Reach is a free-flowing stretch of the main stem. The Columbia was a main stem spawning system, not a tributary spawning system for its major production. And above Grand Coulee, north of the border, below Arrow, which is the first Canadian project, there's some really good habitat. It wouldn't take a lot of money to fix that up, and then you could have another Hanford Reach run, but then you got to get it through the world's longest reservoir. So I don't know what the mortality would be, and the cost would be huge, but it's great. It's been one of the fun things we're doing. So it's always mucking around doing something. So and I don't know where that one will go, because again, it required having very good politics to even get any money free to study it. So the politics have just gone south for everything we do, but we'll see. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
John.
That was fun. Thank you.